I'm Adam Goodhart, Director of the Star Center, and I'm very pleased to introduce our guest, who's Chris Bartlett, the Executive Director of the William Way LGBT Community Center in Philly, my hometown too. Woo!
Woo!
Chris is many things. He is an activist who's been involved in LGBT activism since the days of ACT UP in the 80s. He is also a historian and archivist and preservationist who's done a tremendous amount to collect and save LGBT history, and also to connect that history with the future. Now, LGBT people have a complicated relationship with history. On the one hand, it can be something that we draw inspiration from, sustenance from all of the great figures of the past. We're told we should be proud because Michelangelo was gay, Alexander the Great was gay, right? But at the same time, so much LGBT history has been lost over the years because your Uncle Freddie died, the Uncle Freddie who lived with his friend for so many years, and he dies, and the rest of the family finds all the papers that he had stashed under his bed, and what do they do with them? They go out in the dumpster. The history is difficult because it's often deliberately censored. So there's a lot of talk right now, a lot of buzz around Alexander Hamilton. You've probably heard a little bit about. Well, one thing people don't know is that Alexander Hamilton, with his papers, actually left some fairly steamy letters between him and a young male friend of his, an officer who was finally killed in the Revolution. And these letters were so controversial that actually when Hamilton's children and grandchildren preserved his papers, they cut large sections out of these letters that are lost forever. But just goes to show, even with someone like Hamilton, just how sort of toxic this history was. So this history is incredibly important to preserve. But also, it's important, and I think this is something that Chris Bartlett will get at because of the way that it can cultivate a sense of connection across generations among LGBT people that also often we're told is not there. We're often told that LGBT folks, that we're that sort of like withered leaf at the end of one branch on the family tree with no connection to the generations that came before or after. So Chris is going to talk a bit about history, about the present, about the future. You're going to do it all within cover all of LGBT history? Yeah.
That's my plan.
Anyway, and I should also say one other thing, which is that Chris is part of a really exciting project that we've been working on at Washington College and also in Philly over the past few months. It's the Bearded Ladies, who many of you know, the brilliant and gender-exploring cabaret group from Philly who have been here several times, creating a new piece called the Atomic Family Cabaret. And this is actually being done in conjunction with Washington College students who are over there, some over here. That's
awesome.
Family, members of our family. We've got our brothers and sisters and cousins and funny uncles in that group too. You won't say who's everybody say. No, Nick, you're not that funny. But Chris is also part of the group in Philly that's been practicing and playing and rehearsing every weekend for the past few months, and he's a historian who's also able to perform, did a great performance a few weeks ago, performing an angst-ridden college professor, maybe why I found it so convincing, and is going to be here as part of the Beard's residency for 2 weeks starting on April 5th. So please join me in welcoming Chris Bartlett.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Oh, that was great. I'll try it again. Good evening, everyone. Oh, that's my welcome. I'm so glad that you're here tonight, and it's a real honor. I want to thank the CV Star Center. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here tonight, to be at Washington College. And I've been to Chestertown many times. I love this part of the country, and it's a special treat for me because I'm coming on my 50th birthday today. Yeah, thank you. And it just made sense to me when they said we'd love to have a talk about intergenerational community organizing. I was like, well, I'm turning 50 that day, and it's my first half century. And my first half century sort of coincides with this incredibly fertile time in lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender history. From the time in the 60s when these brilliant and courageous men and women began to imagine that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people had a civil rights movement just like African American people did, just like women did, and that they could fight with the same courage and vision that many brave women and African Americans had done before them. And so I was born that year in 1966. Some of you might have seen the poster for tonight's event with these protesters in front of Independence Hall at the Liberty Bell. And these men and women were so courageous. They marched around Independence Hall and they basically said that gay people had the same civil rights and right to humanity as anyone else. And at that time in 1966, that was completely unbelievable, like that you would dare to say that. You could lose your job, you could lose your family, you could lose everything. And these men and women had the courage to march around with these signs, and they dressed very conservatively because the organizers didn't want the message to be about how people looked. They wanted the messages to be on the signs, which said that gay people deserve civil rights just like everyone else. And when you think that 50 years later, those were the same messages that were used that got us marriage equality this past summer in the Supreme Court in the Obergefell case, which made marriage the right of folks across the land regardless of sexuality. A huge transformation, and I don't think there's any other time where in 50 years you've accomplished so much in so little time. And of course, there's so much more to be done. We have economic justice to look at. We have transgender rights to be fought for with the same energy that we fought for marriage, and many other battles to be fought. But I think part of what I want to bring to you tonight is the power of intergenerational community organizing, queer intergenerational community organizing. And part of that is what I learned in my own story. So go to the next slide. I just talked about these things, the growing acceptance by American society, the movement for marriage equality is a success. More and more families have out LGBT members. So if you don't have a brother or a sister or a mother or a father or a son or a daughter, there's somebody in your family who you know or suspect might be LGBT. That's a huge change. And it's a result of what was a movement in the 70s to say that people should come out. And Harvey Milk, who was one of the first openly gay politicians in San Francisco in the United States, said that gay people should come out, lesbians should come out, and that through being visible, they would transform the world, because up to that time, people weren't visible. And being visible then creates the possibility of connection, and this intergenerational connection where suddenly somebody's older than you, and someone who's younger than you, and you don't feel so alone. And so part of the reason that we need to have this intergenerational moment is because we're at this key transformational time in society where everything seems like, well, we just had this big victory. What is there left to do? And I think part of my experience, and I'll say a little bit about this in a moment, is that even though we've had these successes, you can go to the next slide, that there's still important things to be done. And one of those things is transmittal of LGBT culture across generations. So believing in this culture enough, whether it's books or movies or experiences of our elders, that experience and culture is important to pass on to the next generation. And I learned this from Jewish community organizing, that Jews as a culture have a powerful sense of the value of transmitting culture from one generation to another. African Americans also have this, the necessity of telling the stories of what happened to your grandparents so that your kids will know how to survive in a culture that's racist and where often there can be violence against African Americans. That part of survival is learning what your elders have to teach you. So that transmittal of LGBT culture and the sharing of skills between generations. Also tools for imagining sort of a strategic plan. So we have an LGBT community and culture now that's the result of the vision of those men and women who marched in front of Independence Hall 50 years ago. Much of what they have imagined, we've brought to pass, and as I already mentioned, there's more to do. But where do we imagine LGBT community and culture 50 years from now? There's some different models, and one might be, we're just going to be like everyone else. It won't even matter to be LGBT anymore 50 years from now, because at that point, we'll have done all the work that needs to be done. And I'll say that that's not the vision I have. I actually think that LGBT people have a unique cultural perspective and vision, and that it's important to maintain it. And I learned this also from Jewish culture, that there's a challenge in Jewish culture with assimilation, that as you become accepted into the mainstream society, there's a chance that the culture will become part of the melting pot and lost. And Jewish culture has really found ways to establish rituals and ways of transmitting history and culture onto new generations so that there's a continual new experience of what it means to be Jewish in modern times. And I'm making the case that we need a similar intergenerational model in LGBT community and culture so that we can all imagine what it's going to look like 20, 30, 50 years down the line and help to make that happen. I happen to think that that makes things better for everyone. I've often said that straight men are sometimes the vicious recipients of homophobia. It may not be because they're gay bashed, but because straight men have to make the case that they're not gay. You know, they constantly have to be on guard against perspectives that their gender isn't being put out in the right way or that they might be gay themselves. Similarly, straight women in the past have had to put out the message that they're not lesbian. And so to imagine moving forward that we're going to confront homophobia that creates a world where we can all express our gender identity and sexual orientation without fear, you know, whatever that gender identity or sexual orientation is. And so I think part of the work that we're doing intergenerationally moving forward is to create that world that has a lot more fluidity for people to say, you know, my gender isn't what you expect. There's not a word that really describes my gender. My sexual orientation is fluid. You know, 2 years ago I was dating men, now I'm dating women, and I don't really want to have a sexual orientation identity that's put on me for that. I like to imagine a world where there's the possibility of that fluidity politically, and that we actually create a world where people get to live with true liberation to express their identity. And so part of the work that we're going to be doing, in my opinion, is imagining that world. And I think the main final point I'd make is that other communities, and I've mentioned African American and Jewish, as well as women, have seen that civil and legal civil rights battles don't always lead to stronger communities for the long term. So what I'm really working for is a strong community, a strong sense of the people who are in your neighborhood, who live near you, have your back. And part of what builds that strong sense of community may be around sexual orientation, it may be around gender identity, it may be around race, it may be around culture, ethnicity, but the LGBT culture is part of that conversation and an important one. The next slide. So tonight we'll look at a few intergenerational models of LGBT organizing, examples of organizing that already exist, and you'll leave tonight with some ideas about how you yourself can build intergenerational organizing in your own communities. And I think if I were to leave you with one message leaving tonight, it's to imagine when you're around different communities that it's going to be intergenerational. When you look around, you're going to have friends who are not the same age as you are. And it takes some work to create that world. I think one of the lessons I've learned in my own organizing over the years is it's human nature to end up around people who are like you, whether that's like you by race or gender or sexual orientation or gender identity. It takes some work to create a community where you're around people who are not like you. And my own personal story and the story that I've seen in political organizing is that entrepreneurship and creativity and vision come when you're around people who aren't like you, where your own ideas and ways of thinking are challenged. And I think one of the challenges we face in American society is we often sit in a room like this one where there's no one over the age of 60, I'm guessing, or over 70, you know, whatever the upper edge in this room is. And so to imagine a room that would have a truly intergenerational mix. There are other rooms that are all seniors with no young people in them. And I'm imagining a political effort in the future where we have youth, adults, elders, and even an imagination of ancestors in the room at all times for that mix of ideas that come from those generations. Next slide. So this is me as a youth. That's me in 1966 on Santa's lap. And this is me in 1981. I can't believe my mother let me go out looking like that. But she did. And this kind of world for me, I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I probably very young knew that I was a gay guy. And, you know, and it definitely impacted the way I thought of myself, the way I put myself out into the world. My experience of a youth sort of gradually coming to terms with my homosexuality in a time where there was deep homophobia, where there was deep societal lack of approval, when there were legal consequences to coming out. So I mentioned this, that you know, my own youth experience, and this period between 60 and 85 was a really ripe time. There was a lot of political organizing going on. I was aware, you know, I was aware when Harvey Milk was assassinated, and I was definitely aware in 1981 when the AIDS epidemic came on the scene. my dad actually sat down with me and said, this is something you have to be aware of, that there's this thing called HIV and AIDS happening. So I grew up in this very fertile time where outside of my own personal life, there was all this gay community organizing that I didn't really have an awareness of, but was having an impact in creating the world that I would become an adult in. Next slide. And then as a young adult, I actually went to college to study classics. I studied Latin and Greek, and I was on the path to become a Latin professor. That's what I thought I would become. And at that time in the late 80s, 2 of my close friends got HIV, and then in the end of the 80s died. And it had a huge impact on me as a guy in my early 20s to have close friends of mine die. It sort of woke me up, and I became an activist. I met other people who were thinking about, like, how do we deal with this major crisis facing the gay community? And I became involved with ACT UP, which is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a nonviolent civil disobedience group that aimed to sort of create a better world for people living with HIV. And that's actually me in the center there. This was a demonstration outside of City Hall. And I'm holding, there's somebody lying in that gurney. So we used to do these die-ins where to sort of make visible the fact that so many people were dying and there wasn't awareness of it. We would do these die-ins and sort of publicize what we thought were causing the deaths, whether it was governmental lack of response or the drugs costing too much or whatever it was. You know, I mention ACT UP here because I feel like I was so lucky. Here I am in that picture, 21 years old. And I was so lucky because I would go to these Monday night meetings, and there in the room were people my age, so people in their late teens, early 20s. There were activists in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Like in that room, a complete intergenerational array. And these men and women who were older than I was at the time took me under their wing. And they said, here's how we do activism. Many of them had emerged from the gay civil rights battles, from African American civil rights battles, from feminist battles. And I felt like, you know, I was so lucky to meet these people and really feel like I could imagine living the sort of life that they were living, which was they had a job, but in the evenings they did activism and they tried to make their communities better. And these are 2 of the activists who had a big influence on me. On the left is Kiyoshi Kuramiya. And Kiyoshi, you know, was a huge force in ACT UP, but he also, you know, magically was involved in many other civil rights battles. He was very close friends with Martin Luther King, and on the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was babysitting King's children. So he was that close in the family, and he'd gone down for many of the Freedom Ride demonstrations in the South. He himself was born on one of the Japanese concentration camps. So during World War II, the Japanese were herded from wherever they lived and put in concentration camps in Wyoming. And he grew up on one of these, and I think it sort of imbued him with the sense of the importance of doing community work. He ended up in Philadelphia, going to Penn, and got involved in all sorts of activist work. I think, you know, one of the great stories that really struck me was as an anti-Vietnam War activist, he had gone in front of the Penn campus and said that he was going to burn a dog with napalm. And so he, you know, thousands of students literally showed up outraged that you could burn a dog with napalm on the Penn campus. And he showed up with the dog and with the napalm, and everyone was chanting and outraged. And he said, you know, I'm not going to burn this dog. Thank you for saving the dog. If only you cared as much about the Vietnamese as you did about this dog. And it was just like a powerful moment. And he would share these stories. And so for me, as a young, not even an adult yet, I was still a youth, to get exposed to the vision and wisdom of this guy who was, you know, making a difference on the world stage, it helped me to imagine that I myself could make a difference on whatever issue I cared about. And at that time, it was about gay rights and it was about HIV and AIDS. But I often say, you know, if you can, you know, for me, I left college with the belief that I personally could make a difference about any political issue that I cared about. And it's largely because I met people like this who I saw doing it. And it's where I began to see, my God, I want to be around older people. And you know, I was a young guy. I wanted to be around young people too. I was going dancing every night. I was doing all the things young people do. I was easily distractible. I was having a lot of fun. You know, my grades weren't so great at the end of college because I was having all that fun. And I was doing all this activism. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that I met Kiyoshi and I met Dominic Bash. So Dominic was, you know, an Italian guy who grew up in the Catholic Church, and he became an activist confronting the Catholic Church about its homophobia. And you can imagine if he looked like this, it was quite a confrontation. He used to go up to the cardinal in Philadelphia and talk to the cardinal about the condoms should be given out in the Catholic schools, which, you know, no one could imagine doing that. But he would show up at the cathedral and have that conversation with the cardinal. So courageous, and that's actually me standing behind him. So you can see how young I was at the time I got to know this guy. And again, somebody who mentored me that it was okay to be courageous, to be brash, to confront people with power, to have my own voice, to speak the truth. And I think if I hadn't been in an intergenerational community where I was learning these things from people like Yoshi and Dominic, I wouldn't have gotten those lessons. And so I came out of this ACT UP period in my life, and can go to the next slide. And then I began to do what I considered to be more adult things. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but part of the adult piece was really getting involved in being responsible in the community and being responsible for organizations, raising money, working with younger people, beginning to take on the role that I had seen with older people, imagining that I could provide to people in their 20s would have been provided to me. So part of this model is two-way street, that you're being open to being mentored and in fact looking around for mentors. And if you don't have a mentor, just go find one. Like find someone who, and don't let them say no. Like it's one of the things that I really learned is that when I wanted somebody to be their mentor, I would ask them multiple times, or I would let them know I wasn't going away until they were willing to take me on as a mentor. Having that mentor is really valuable, and then at some point in your life, to offer the two-way street when you become a mentor to somebody else. And I'm going to share a model of mentorship that I think is powerful a little bit later on in the talk. But if you go through your whole life with the perspective, I should always have a mentor and I should always be mentoring, it's incredibly powerful. And I sometimes feel like I get more from the mentoring than I do from the mentor. And one of the powerful things about youth, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that young people are not constrained by the paradigms and boxes that we as adults or elders are constrained by. So I'll cut you in on a little secret. I still think about my political world largely in the way I was trained by ACT UP 25 years ago. It's just that early activism had a big impact on me. So now when I have young activists from the Black Lives Matter movement, young feminists come to me, young trans activists challenging me on my ideas of gender, which are, I grew up in a time when there was male or female, and that was just the way I was taught to think. And now I have trans activists in my life who are challenging me to think of a broader perspective on gender. It's transformed my life. It's actually liberated me to imagine a world where some of the maleness that I've taken on doesn't always feel comfortable. I have more fluidity in my gender. I can embrace some of the feminine sides of me, and the trans movement's offered me that. So I think the powerful thing that youth offer the mentors is an openness to a new way of thinking about the world. They're not boxed in by the old ways of thinking. They can allow themselves new paradigms. And they're not fearful. Like when you've been around for 25 years thinking one way, it's hard to let go of that way of thinking because you're deeply invested in it. So find a mentor and be mentoring. I think that's really important to go into the world with that perspective. And there are many places where we see this in the 12-step world where you have a sponsor, but you're also a sponsee. And you're not going to be sponsoring someone if you don't have a sponsor yourself. And I feel that mentoring is similar. You shouldn't be mentoring people unless you have a mentor yourself. So there's this flow of knowledge, experience, wisdom that goes through the generations. And so in my adult world, I started noticing even older people coming into my lives. So this is Kayla Husen in the middle. Kayla Husen was one of those founding mothers who marched in front of Independence Hall. She's still alive, and she lives in Kennett Square, which is southeast of Philadelphia. She lives in a Quaker retirement community there. And now she's my friend. She's 85 years old. And I go to visit her, and she gives me assignments. I go in there, and I get a list of 6 things she wants me to do. And when you're talking to an 85-year-old woman who changed the world, you can't really say no to her. But it's also transformational for me that I get embraced by her and get invited into her world and get to see how she thinks. So Kayla Husen's been a huge influence. Randy Wicker, who's in the pink. Randy was he was actually at the first gay rights demonstration ever in the whole world in New York City in the 1950s. He's still alive. Randy just was chatting with me about my 50th birthday and telling me how young I am because he's in his 80s. But Randy's really challenged me. He's a transgender activist at this age. He's one of these people who is in his 80s, has embraced trans activism, which not many older activists do, so I applaud him. And I think the great thing I've gotten from him is that you can be 80 and still be open to new ways of thinking. It's not true that you can't teach an old dog new tricks if you have openness, if you have willingness, open-mindedness to new ways of thinking. And it's really, I think, it's one of the ways that I end up at 50 not feeling burned out and feeling excited about the activism that I go into, because I'm exposing myself, as I already mentioned, to younger people, but also older people like Randy, who allow themselves to be continually impacted by new ideas. And down here's Tyrone Smith, who, another big piece for me is diversity of mentorship and menteeship. So, part of the power of my early organizing, in addition to ACT UP, I went out and got to know black gay men in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is a largely African-American city. It's 48, 49% African-American. And that's a huge, I knew if I was going to do gay community organizing work and I wasn't working with black gay men, there was something off, because there were a lot of black gay men in the community who I would want to work with. And so I met Tyrone early on. And Tyrone actually puts his black identity before his gay identity, which was really powerful for me to get introduced into the African-American worlds that he resided in. And part of that was just strategic. He knew that at a time when some of those worlds, especially the church worlds, were really homophobic, that he had to find a way to go in from his black identity and get embraced through that, and then be able to organize around gay issues, to the point now where we've come so much further in the black gay community in Philadelphia in terms of being able to have conversations around homophobia and transphobia in those communities. It's remarkable. But having him as a mentor, and Tyrone's also in his 70s, again, I'm trying to say, like, if you were to look at your own list of folks in your life, how many people do you have in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? How close are you to your grandparents if they're still alive? I think that my grandmother was incredibly close to me, and it was powerful when I was going through the AIDS epidemic in the bad years before the treatments were available and people were dying a lot, that my grandmother had a lot of friends dying at the same time, and we used to have lunch together and have sort of these sort of ironic conversations about how strange it was that we were both having a lot of deaths in our lives, but she was able to give me support. And I think the greatest thing my grandmother taught me, and this is one practical exercise you could do when you go out into the world, is how not to have senior people be invisible. And really, senior people means anyone who is older than you. That's what I've discovered. I'm 50. I already am invisible to a lot of people in Philadelphia. I can see it. You're walking down the street and it's as if I'm not there. Or even in community conversations, it can be as if I'm not there. What would it be like as you go out into the world to confront that invisibility, actually to say hello to someone who's older than you are, engage with someone who's older than you are, or perhaps engage with someone who's much younger? Again, it goes in both directions. And I'm going to be talking about ancestors a little bit later. The other thing, when my grandmother died at age 100, 10 years ago, she taught me how not to have ancestors be invisible. And that's another big piece. What do you know about your ancestors, both your own familial ancestors and your cultural ancestors? So getting to know who the LGBT ancestors are, getting to know who died in the AIDS epidemic, like these incredibly visionary, powerful people. I'm going to talk a little bit of it later on about how I do that, how I keep the ancestors really present in my life. But invisibility is really key. And invisibility can show up a lot of ways in terms of diversity, whether women are invisible in your life or men are invisible, trans people are invisible. But I think age is really key. I promise you your life will be transformed in a powerful way if you begin to practice not letting older people be invisible and engaging with them and finding worlds where older people are and making sure that they see you and making sure that you see them, that two-way street. Next slide. So this is sort of where I'm going now. Don't I look like I'm sort of getting more of an elder? The gray hair's coming in. But the part of the elder role, I think, is really to imagine where the community and culture is going 3 or 4 or 5 generations down the line. And I'm 50 years old and I'm embracing elder, like I'm embracing senior. Like some people might say that's way too young. Some people do say that to me. But in a second I'm going to talk about, it doesn't really have to do with the number of your age. It has to do with the role. And if you're willing to take on embracing a role, there are 20-year-old seniors. We call them old souls, but you meet them and you think they have the wisdom and engagement of a senior. And trust me, there are 70-year-old youth, who continue to have the that playfulness and sort of that awareness of new paradigms that I was talking about, not being boxed down by the old ways. 70-year-old youth. So it doesn't really have anything to do with a number. So when you think about how you position yourself, do you think of yourself as a youth, as an adult, as an elder, or as an ancestor? And I'll ask you that a little bit later on. All right, next slide. So youth, adults, elders, and ancestors. I'll take you through this now. Next slide. So I just wanted to do a little quick survey. Just raise your hand. How many people 15 to 25? So that's the majority, which we would expect. How many 26 to 40? 4 folks there. How many 41 to 60? 4, 5 there. And how many older than 61? 1, 2, 3, 4. So, in a college audience, we'd expect the majority would be in that first category, and then sort of evenly distributed between the other 3 categories. Next slide. And how many of you have close friends in these age groups? So raise your hand if you have close friends in the 15 to 25 age group. And so almost everyone does. How about the 26 to 40? Just about everyone. How about 41 to 60? Close friends. That's pretty impressive. And how about older than 61? Yeah, so that's a gap. Just noticing that. There are a good number of people, more than I would expect, and more than in many audiences. But just thinking about why is that? Why is it that older than 61, there begins to be more of a gap? And I would say it's probably something structural about our society, that it's harder. It takes more of an effort to meet people in both directions, for older people to meet younger and younger to meet older. But just to take note of that segregation that happens, both naturally but structurally, the way our community organizations are set up and where it is that you would meet older people. Next slide. So I was talking about those different categories, and I wanted to give some definitions. Youth, building innovation, thinking outside of the box, providing strong energy, challenging established ways of thinking. I'm encouraging anyone to raise their hand at any point if you either want to challenge, ask questions, or have a different point of view. I definitely welcome that, just so you know. That's youth. Then adults, responsible for the maintenance of the community, paying the bills, blessing the youth, connecting with and respecting the elders. So the adults have this functional role of being responsible for the community, making sure the doors are open. They're the sorts of ones who are on the church boards or the boards of directors of nonprofits, or raising the money to make sure that organizations run. This blessing the youth piece is really important. And Kill Hefner, who wrote this article, Gay Adults, Where Are You? Blessing the youth actually means having a conversation with the youth where you see what their strength is, what their power is, and embracing it, and helping them to see what that strength and power is, getting behind it. It's not trying to control them or tell them what their strength should be, but actually helping them in conversation to identify it themselves and then supporting it. So blessing the youth and connecting with and respecting the elders. So the adults are looking in both directions, looking towards the youth and looking towards the elders. Next one. The elders themselves, responsible for the future 6 generations of the community, envisioning the collective future beyond the present. And this is really both through their experience of being youth and adults, and also through the collective adult-elder conversation, they get to envision where we're going six generations down the line. And if you're one of those people who's 20 years old who's already doing that, you may be an elder. And eldering takes on that, not only for worrying about whether the community is going to work now, but whether it's going to work well into the future. And then ancestors, looking out for the welfare of both the individual and the tribe. They're a vast storehouse of information, so they contain centuries past of the community's experience and culture. And they're accessible by elders, shamans, and healers. And one of the key points that I've come to terms with is how much ancestors are left out. When people die, they tend to get written off. Now, depending on your culture, you may go to the grave of a grandparent and an uncle, aunt once a year or twice a year, or maybe more frequently. But actually to imagine what it would be like to include ancestors on a regular basis. These can be your family ancestors, or they could be cultural ancestors. So somebody you claim as your own. So if you're a trans person, a trans ancestor, somebody who's no longer here, but who played an important role in trans culture, who you view as your ancestor. And LGBT ancestors, for me, I claim them all the time. And sometimes I know they're gay, lesbian, bi, or trans. Sometimes I'm not sure, but I still claim them anyway. Socrates, for example, definitely a homosexual guy. The culture was completely different in ancient Greece. But to imagine him as an ancestor of mine, and that part of what he wrote about in his philosophy was powerful male-male relationships. Like, that's something I want to claim as an ancestor as part of my community and culture. So ancestors are really important. Next slide. The key idea is that the roles, as I said, are independent of age. So to really think that regardless of your age, you could claim any of them. And in fact, you can claim more than one. You might imagine that you fulfill on the roles of more than just youth, adult, elder, and ancestor. Maybe you have multiple ones. And so this is sometimes controversial, but the model I put forward is the adults teach the youth to be adults. So the adults adult the youth. And you need adults to educate the youth how to become adults. If that doesn't happen, and part of the argument of this article is that there aren't enough gay adults, and that oftentimes gay men and lesbians, for whatever reason, do not want to take on that adult responsibility. And so we need folks to teach the youth how to become adults. And I think this has really been a transformation in the last 10 to 15 years when there are many more LGBT adults doing this role of educating youth about how to step into an adult role. And then elders teach the adults to be elders. And one of the lines of Kilhefner is, if you're not an elder, you're an older. And so an older is sort of that invisible person I was talking about who does not have authority, who does not have influence within the community. And the argument here is that in order to be an elder, you need to be taught by an elder to become one. And so again, this intergenerational model where you're mentored into eldering is really important. And then the ancestors teach the elders to be ancestors. So the elders are in conversation with the ancestors to figure out what they're going to be like as ancestors. And I think we can see this. Like, there are people who die and continue to be influential after they die. They're powerful ancestors. That doesn't happen randomly. It's because they've done the work as elders to make sure that they will continue on in an ancestor role after they die. And I think this is really important for cultures to have those powerful ancestors so that you can imagine this trajectory. I remember a time when I was a young gay guy when people would say that all life ends after 30. It was just imagined that as you got older, there was nothing really to live for. People would actually say that, and I never really believed it. But I've always, part of my community organizing has been to create a gay world where I'm really excited to grow old. I always joke that I tell people I'm 10 years older than I am. So, I'm 50 today, I'll tell people I'm 60, just for embracing what it's like to be older and not to be ashamed of it, and to confront ageism, and to begin to create a culture where we're actually excited to grow old, to imagine that as elders in a community, that's something to look forward to. So I think that that's really important, that this model where we get taught about the excitement of stepping into the next role is an important part of the model. Next slide. I mentioned that you can be more than one role. Important to bless the youth and accept their blessings in return, so it's a two-way street. And if adults don't become elders, they become olders. And I think that one really is key, and I think continues to be a major dynamic in LGBT communities, where both because older people are allowed to become invisible, that there's not enough empowering in either direction between elders and adults, that we lose all that wisdom and skill and value that comes from the elder experience. So it's why I'm challenging us all not to let people become invisible in either direction, and really have that be something you could emerge from tonight as a new consciousness. Next slide. So now we'll do a little survey. How many of you, if you had to choose one of these, youth, adult, elder, ancestor, or other, so those are your 5 choices, which would you choose? So how many identify as youth?
Well, you said we could choose more than one, right? People have different...
Good point. I'm glad you're pushing back. All right, so I'm going to change this. You can choose more than one. All right, so how many identify as youth? All right. And how many identify as adults? And how many identify as elders? And that's where the hands start to, I did an interesting version of this where we had people do questions, but they had to question from the youth, adult, or elder microphone. And no one would go to the elder microphone. It was just like, there was elder shame in the room. So I think it's, one more, let's see how many elders there are, and just look around at that. Raise your hand if you identify at all as elder. So it looks like there's 6, which is pretty good, actually. How many identify as ancestor? None. It's okay to do that, even before you die. All right. All right, next slide. Or any other, anyone who identifies something other than up there? All right, good. Next slide. So now some models for exploring this intergenerational dynamic. This one I call secret mentorship, and it's a youth adult model. These are 3 African-American mentors from, two of them died of HIV, and the guy in the center is still alive. But they were very powerful mentors to me early in my career about thinking about African-American community organizing. Next slide. So the idea behind secret mentorship is you make a list. I have mine as a Google document, actually. And on my Google document, I list people who I'm intentionally, secretly mentoring. And what secret mentorship means is that you have an intention of being of service to these men or women, and you're going to make a difference in their lives. You might invite them to come, like one of my secret mentors might be here. I could invite them to come hear me speak. I might send them an article to read. I might take them out to lunch, invite them on vacation with me. But you have a list, and for me, it's important that it be a diverse list. So I want men, women, people of color, trans people. For me, I like to have that diversity because I said I learn the most from people who are different from me, who I think might be, and then I see how much the same they are. So having this list of secret mentors, so you're going to have that intention. So what would that be like if you actually tried it? And for me, it's been incredibly powerful. You know, when I wrote this, I wrote an article about this probably 10 years ago, and it came out of one of my secret mentors. He had a conversation with a community organizer, and she said to him, there's not enough people mentoring sex-positive gay men, and you should do it. And this guy, Eric Rofus, who was a fantastic writer on gay culture, he said, I'll do it, but I'm not going to tell them. So he chose me, and he chose 7 other gay men, and he began to mentor us in this way, inviting us to come to talks, sending us articles, taking us on vacation with him. You know, the interesting thing about being secret, he said he thought it would be hierarchical if he actually said, I'm your mentor. Like, who really wants that? You know, I don't know about you, but as a young person, I was pretty rebellious. I didn't want anyone to mentor me. But the fact that he was secretly doing it, I was okay with that. Like, I was okay with all the benefits as long as it wasn't called mentorship. And so I had this guy who was watching out for me, and he died 10 years ago. And when he died, I knew who the other 6 mentees were. They didn't know. And I had this question to myself, should I tell them? You know, would he have wanted me to tell them? And I decided to tell them. We had lunch all together. I said, Eric was doing this thing. And sure enough, a couple of them were like, oh, that's weird. You know, but I was like, but didn't you appreciate it? Yeah, I appreciated it, but it's weird. And so like there's some people who, you know, if they had known, wouldn't have been open to it. And I think it's one of the key things to notice. Like, we're sensitive people, I think, and we can know if someone is not interested. Like, if you start to be of service in this way and it's clear the person's like not responsive, cross them off your list. Because there are people who are interested in having this sort of support from you, trust me. And it's just having the willingness to have the intention. And that's what the Google document does for me. So over the past 15 years, I think I've had 25 people on the list. Some of them have crossed off at points when they went out of my life, or I had the sense it wasn't a good match. But I have a really diverse crew of secret mentees now. And what it's allowed me to do is build this community where I'm being supportive. I have an intergenerational community. I'm doing some adulting. I'm teaching them how to be adults. They're also teaching me how to be more youthful, which at 50 I can benefit from. Like, it's a lot of skills that come from those mutual conversations. And the sort of things I provide, listening, assisting them into growing into their future, technical assistance, invitations, ongoing connectedness. And I said here that it's recommended that sex is not in the picture. You know, why do I say that? It's not because I'm, sex negative. I think sex is bad. But I think that, especially with young people, it brings in a dynamic that's unhealthy in terms of the interaction. And it can raise distrust. It can make it complicated in ways that it doesn't need to be. And so that's just a recommendation. You'll do your secret mentoring. That's been my personal commitment, is that the mentorship connections I have are not going to be sexual ones. And it's interesting. I want to go into this a little bit, because sometimes when you get into a place of emotional intimacy or connectedness with someone, there are some people who the only thing they know what to do with that is a sexual connection, or it becomes sexually charged. So you need to have the commitment yourself going into it, because it may not be you who's the one for whom the sexual charges arises. And so I just think it's important for you to be clear yourself in that piece, what you're going to do with it. And as I mentioned earlier, I think if you're going to be a secret mentee, you should have a secret mentor. And that may be where You don't tell them that they're mentoring, but again, you go down and hunt them down. It could be, and again, it doesn't have anything to do with age. I want to say that your mentees don't all have to be younger. You can have older people who you're mentoring, and your mentors don't need to be older. So disconnecting from your head that it has something to do with age. At times, age will play into your decision. But part of this is just creating an intergenerational connectedness of people who you're of service to and people who are providing service to you, that two-way street. Next slide. So before I go on to the queer bar mitzvah, what do people think about that secret mentorship idea? Just a couple responses to it.
So you brought up if you're trying to have a secret mentorship with someone and they aren't responsive to it, just to move on from that person. Kind of along that point, what if someone is seeking your help, but to provide that help is a frustrating or difficult experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. What if somebody, or what if, that could be, what if you're that person or you get the sense that the person, there's not a good connection? I think that for me would be a moment where having the secret mentor to go to and say, I have this person, the situation's become complicated, they're really annoying, I don't know what to do about it. And then your secret mentor says, well, here's how I'd handle that. And that's why to have the two-way street, you have somebody you can go to, and they say, oh, I had that exact same annoying person 5 years ago, and here's how I handled it. And usually there are compassionate ways to deal with it, or it may be setting boundaries, or it may be sharing the responsibility for mentoring that person with somebody else. I think the main thing is not to feel alone, which is the whole purpose of this, not to feel alone, to feel connected, to feel like you have a sense of community. Any other feedback, thoughts on this one? Is anybody going to try it? Oh, I see one head shaking, that's great. Oh, a few people, yeah, that's great. Okay, so the queer bar and bat mitzvah. Some of you may recognize this image from Transparent, which is there's some great home video footage in the beginning of Transparent of a bar mitzvah, and this kid's sort of doing a Vogue ball like scene walking around the bar mitzvah, so I love that image. Next slide. Yeah, so this is where I was thinking about, wouldn't it be cool to have a ritual of adulthood, where you, as a queer person, step into adulthood, embrace adulthood, and that you do it in front of the community. And I grew up in a Jewish community in Cheltenham, Pennsylvania, very influenced by Jewish culture in the ways I think about gay community organizing. And I used to go to these bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs where boys and girls would stand up and they would become adults in the eyes of the community at age 13. I thought that was so cool. And they'd recite a piece of Torah, and they had to memorize it, learn something from Jewish culture, stand in front of the community, do something that took some courage. And then there was a big party afterwards, and you get to eat a lot and be with the people who loved you, like really cool model. And I thought, what if we had a queer bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, and it probably wouldn't be at age 13, it could be at any age, where you finally are saying, I am a queer adult, and I am taking on those responsibilities that Chris listed earlier on, as well as a few others. I've had a conversation with other queer adults about what it means, and now I'm going to stand up in front of the community. I'm going to memorize some text. Maybe it's a poem of Walt Whitman. Maybe it's Audre Lorde. Maybe it's Kate Bornstein, somebody who inspired you. And you memorize a bit of this text and you stand up in front of the community and you recite it. You do a few other projects, a community-oriented project to support some piece of the community that matters to you. You create the music list for it. So, maybe you're into disco, maybe you're into rap, I don't know what it is, but you would have queer music, whatever that means to you, that would get played as part of the ritual. And then you would stand in front of the community and have queer elders and youth. And the queer elders would acknowledge you now as an adult. You are now an adult. And you'd have the young people celebrating you. Yeah, it's time for you to move on, girl. It's time for you to be an adult. We're ready for you to do that. And now you've said that in front of the community. There's no backing away from it now. And there's something powerful about that, of like actually claiming I'm an adult now. And I'm leaving behind youth and I'm taking on adult. So, I mentioned, I think, most of these things already. And as I've thought, I've actually begun to have conversations with groups of people about what the queer bar or bat mitzvah would look like. How to do it to maybe separate it from gender for people who don't, so bar is the male prefix, bat is the female prefix. Maybe there would be a gender neutral or a non-gendered prefix for the term so that queer people who would want that sort of term could use it. And then having the actual cultural pieces of the bar mitzvah be identified by the individual. So you would get to say what the literature would be for you. You would get to say what the music is for you. And you would get to identify which community is there to support you. And I believe that this is really needed. I think that in our communities, we need to have this moment where we claim adult and we get to do it visibly in front of others. Is that a hand?
Yeah. I wonder what your idea of queer adulthood is. Because there's a couple ways that I can imagine that, right? One is probably more along the lines of age and how old someone is, but also like you may have people, especially that come out later in life, and what is their kind of cultural identity, adulthood, where they're at in the development.
It's a great question. And you know, it's interesting, there are adult bar mitzvahs. So if you come to Judaism later in life, you can do your bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah at any point in your life. And so I thought of similarly with this, that you might not claim adulthood till you're 70. Like it might have taken you that long to, you know, for various reasons. Maybe you only recently came out as gay. Maybe you've wanted to be a youth all that time. You've really enjoyed it, but now you're ready to be an adult. So I think you're absolutely right. It could be, and that's why I wouldn't identify a particular age. And that it would be in conversation with your adult mentors. Am I ready? Yeah, you're ready. You know, whether you're 25 or maybe you're 10. You know, maybe there's a 10-year-old who's ready to be a queer adult. I've certainly met them. Or maybe you're much older. And I think the one question this does leave me is whether there's a similar eldering ritual, you know, and whether that has a different name, where you're actually leaving adult behind and stepping into elder. And again, that can be completely independent of age. I'm part of the Radical Fairies, which is a group of queer people who, you know, believe that LGBT culture is fundamental. You know, the best way of putting it is anti-assimilationist. So they're not interested in becoming part of the mainstream. They're interested in exploring and celebrating what's unique and powerful about being LGBT, like celebrating that culture. So in that world, I've met so many 20-year-old elders. I'm just blown away. Like, people, I'm like, how did this happen to you? But we just do meet these people who somehow, at a very young age, have come to terms with a lot of wisdom, and you just see it. And I've certainly met 70-year-old youth who are still partying till 3 in the morning and, you know, just crazy, wild, just completely uninterested in responsibility. They don't want a job, you know, and they're very happy. Their whole life has been like that. So, you know, I come from a world where that flexibility around these roles really makes sense. And I think the strange thing for me is that I've been hungry to be an elder for a long time. Like, and I've met other guys like me who are like age 30 dyeing their hair gray, you know, which might seem really odd, you know. But I was excited when my hair turned gray. Like, I can't imagine dyeing my hair. It just feels like part of my identity is to like be somebody who people look at and think, he's an older person. But then I'm comfortable in it. And I clearly have some youth energy in me too. Like, I embrace that part of me. But I think the power of the ritual is that whatever you choose to be, you get to do it in front of the community. Start with you and then you.
Okay. So, as you mentioned earlier, people can kind of have more than one role at a time. And if you're envisioning these rituals that are, you know, really neat and I think have a lot of value, is there any possibility of saying at one point, okay, now I feel like I'm going to step into the adult role, but, you know, because of circumstances or the people around you or whatever, you're like, all right, I need to step back, or I need to go into a different one. Like, what flexibility do you see in that?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think for me, without having thought about it a whole lot, it's about not making the decision alone. So having that network of support where you turn to the elders who counseled you and the other adults and you say, you know, I think this isn't working for me. I want to go back to youth. And they're like, great. You know, maybe there's a reverse ritual where, you know, you get to do a whole bunch of youthful types of stuff. And I think you could imagine that maybe that's the queerness of it, that our bar mitzvah, you can go in the other direction and be like, I'm going to be a youth again. Like, that suddenly got me excited, so there must be some truth to it. But I think that makes sense, that it can go in multiple directions. But I think the key thing is that you would have a community who's advising you. Like, part of it for me is like people have seen me as an elder for a long time and sort of invited me into it. And so even before I was really aware, they're like pointing to me, like, you have this role, you should write about that some more, you should perform that, well before I saw it myself. And so I think it's that because I was in a community, I was in the ACT UP community, where people would be like, you're a great facilitator, facilitate these meetings. And this was like 50-year-olds who were saying it to me as a 22-year-old. That was really flattering, but they were also seeing something in me and inviting me into it. And that's kind of that blessing piece I was talking about. Like as an adult, if I see a young person, I can bless them by saying, you know, you're really good at facilitating. Why don't you facilitate this meeting? And I'm going to tell all those windbag 50-year-olds to step aside and make room for you, actually creating a space for it.
Yeah, so I really like the way you framed the concept of LGBT or queer culture being like a defined point where, a ritual like this would benefit. But there are, from my perspective, there are a lot of, LGBT people that see, their sexual orientation or their identity as something that's, just like their, the color of their hair or their skin, or just, it's another part of them. And I identify as part of that camp. So how do you think a ritual like this or this type of bar bat mitzvah would play for individuals that just see or define their sexuality as something like their skin color?
Yeah. The way I think about this is, will LGBT culture, will we be like the Irish or will we be like the Jews? Like, this is how I distinguish this. So if we're like the Jews, we're committed to having a multi-generational culture that gets transmitted for all time. If we're like the Irish, it's kind of like being redheaded. There's a couple nice bars, you're gonna have a nice parade, but and maybe some Irish people will be offended by this, so please call me out on it if you want. But Irish culture, at least in America, is not what it was 50 years ago. Like, if you're Irish, you're American. You're just like everyone else. And it's kind of like being redheaded, So I don't know if that's a fair analogy to what you're getting at, but I think queer people get to make that decision. I'm more interested, I'm like speaking for someone else, I'm just more interested in being, an American and being a citizen, and my LGBT part of my identity is not that big a deal. And thank God for the civil rights movement that's gotten us to the point where I no longer get beat up and I can get married and I can mostly get treated like everyone else. So I think that LGBT culture has to be big enough to allow people those choices, and I think American culture is that story of, you get to choose the melting pot, I just want to get melted in, or I'm an Orthodox Jew, I don't really want to be around other Americans, I want to be in a Jewish ghetto with other Jews celebrating Jewish culture, and then everything in between. So sometimes I say I'm an Orthodox gay. I like to be around other queer people, imagining queer community. I like having straight people around, but only if they want to be around me. Like, that's kind of what my world looks like, if they're interested in engaging with my world. And I'm a pretty diverse person, so I'm going out into other worlds. But I'm not a sort of person who's just interested in sort of joining mainstream America. And I think that part of what we're struggling with right now in this moment, with marriage being settled, is, can we create an LGBT culture where people get to make that choice? And I hope yes. I hope the answer is yes. That the vision you have can stand alongside the vision that I have. You have Jews who only show up for the high holidays, and they're embraced to show up at synagogue, even though everyone knows, they're not a very serious Jew, And so you could imagine a similar world where, like, people like me, like, he's not a very serious gay, but he's showing up for this ritual anyway, so we're glad he's here. And on the other side, those people are like, those crazy gays, it's all they're about, and can't they be bigger than just gay, the things that get said when other people aren't in the room. But I do hope we have a big enough culture that they can coexist.
I'm wondering how you plan on spreading this culture to places that don't have a whole lot of, a big sense of community. Like, I'm from Texas, so I've had next to no sense of LGBT community. And so that's one of the really cool things about being here on the East Coast, that I'm surrounded more so by it. But if I were to go home, I'm essentially in a desert again, where the only way I can contact people is via the internet.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think that, there are great books on rural LGBT experience. One of the things I love, about the Radical Fairies is they have a real rural commitment. They're not just about the cities. And so imagining what an LGBT culture looks like in the heart of Texas, where you're, 200 miles away from the largest city, and the only support, as you say, is the internet. So again, I feel that that's part of imagining, exploring what LGBT culture looks like. Jews have learned to do this. The Jews who live in big cities, Jews who live in rural, isolated communities. And I think we've learned to do it too, and it is documented, but maybe we're just not as widely aware of it. So everyone knows there's queers everywhere in Texas, and they have to learn how to survive. And some of them survive by moving away and going to the big cities. Some of them survive by staying at home and figuring out how to do that and deal with the homophobia they have to deal with. But they love living in Texas. They're not leaving, and maybe they prioritize other elements of their identity. So I view LGBT culture as very similar to Jewish. It's cosmopolitan, it contains all kinds of multitudes, and it allows for a huge amount of difference. And that, we thought that marriage equality as a decision would be the answer, or maybe some of us did. And this is where I draw another analogy that, Jews have Israel. Wherever you stand on Israel, whether you're a Zionist or whether you're really opposed to Israel's policies, it's a fundamental force in Jewish life, Israel. What do you think about Israel? Do you send money to Israel? Have you visited Israel? So we had our Israel. AIDS was our Israel. For years we organized around AIDS. LGBT people organized around AIDS. They raised money for AIDS. We built institutions for AIDS. Then largely treatments came in. People didn't die in the same ways, especially if they were white. And so, AIDS wasn't so much our Israel anymore. Then marriage became our Israel. Everyone organized around marriage. Everyone's excited about marriage. I never would have imagined 25 years ago that I would fight for marriage. I would have laughed if you'd said that would be our issue. But marriage was our Israel, and we succeeded this past June in largely putting that to rest as our Israel. So what's our next Israel? And how? Maybe you don't have one Israel. Maybe our community is so diverse that trans civil rights is one Israel. Economic justice is another Israel. Rural LGBT rights is another Israel. It's harder to organize when it's not something that everyone can get behind and be passionate about. And sometimes I think it would be nice if we had a queer Israel, like an actual geographic place, which was ours. And everyone would hate or love it in the same way that Jews hate or love Israel. So I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but broadly what I'm saying is that I hope that the diversity of LGBT culture could imagine what does a rural LGBT experience look like. And the Jewish responsa, the rabbinical responsa, which are when rabbis think through ethical questions, they think through ethical questions for all kinds of worlds. And that's the beauty. That's the beauty of the way that the rabbis think about questions. So they have universal questions that apply to Jews everywhere. Like one of the responses I just looked at the other night, just to share with you. Like, what happens if you live north of the Arctic Circle and the sun doesn't set or rise? So how do you determine when Shabbat is? Like, I never would have thought of this. But if you live north of the Arctic Circle, there's no sunset and no sunrise. So, that's a key moment in the Jewish week. And technically, the sun rises on a certain day at the beginning of the summer in the Arctic Circle, and then it doesn't go down for months. So there's just one day. Like, technically, the sun doesn't set. This may seem totally crazy that I'm raising this, but it's the rabbis have thought about this deeply. And so what I think is we need queer rabbis who are figuring out these questions. And so trans rabbi blah blah says this, and this is how she thinks about living in Texas, and this is what it should look like, and we need to think about queer life in Texas this way. And other queer rabbi Y says exactly the opposite. And it's not about either of the rabbis being right. It's the richness of all these rabbis weighing in on a question. And then, that's what the Talmud is. It's like Jews don't agree about anything. It's like, but it's the beauty of all the disagreement on one page. And so, whether it's disagreeing about whether gayness has to be fundamental to our identity, or disagreeing about whether rural people should just leave and move to Philadelphia or should stay where they are. That's what this is all about. How much, I just want to see how much time we have. Go right ahead.
You may have just answered this question, but I was curious as to how and where you might draw the dotted line with allies as a member of PFLAG and PFLAG community around your parents. And I love your idea of the community itself, but there are allies who have been involved, want to be involved.
I see allies as totally part of it. It's one of those interesting things I noticed. So I do a lot of presentations to business groups, ERGs, employee resource groups, so like Comcast or Pico, or these companies will have all their employees come together and I'll go and speak to them. The employee resource groups will have 800 people and 75% of them are allies. It's like, this is what our movement looks like. I sometimes say the allies care more about our movement than we do. Thank you. Like, thank you that you care so much about our movement. And that's because so many allies have family, friends, loved ones. And some of us are tired, so thank God the allies are there to bring some new energy to the movement. But I think that part of the beauty of the new openness to fluidity around sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, is that, queerness includes straight people now. Queerness includes people of all kinds of genders. So you can identify as queer as a straight man, and I hope you do, because it opens you up to this new world. Like, queerness is more, to me, about being open to difference and open to flexibility and fluidity, as opposed to wanting to keep people in boxes. So the allies are key to that. And I think, again, just like I said, we learn the most from people who are different from us. We need allies in the room to challenge us, when our ideas are crazy. Or even when they make sense, but there's maybe a way of tweaking them to make them better. So thank God for PFLAG. Thank God for PFLAG, and thank God for progressive churches that welcomed LGBT people early on, and synagogues, and like so many other examples where, straight people played a key role. And, similar in the Black Civil Rights Movement, Jews, white people, all kinds of people were there as part of that movement. And it might have succeeded without them, but it definitely would have looked different. And I feel like, at this key moment, I'm so glad all of the allies are there, especially the allies who share this vision for me of like, queer culture is worth celebrating, and I'm part of it. It's not like you're outside of it. All right, next slide. So intergenerational ballroom culture, for folks who don't know about this, it's a largely people of color cultural phenomena. It's beautiful. It goes back generations. So, you might have seen the movie Paris is Burning, and if you haven't, I really recommend. I think it's on Netflix, definitely on Hulu. But Paris is Burning tells the story of the ballroom culture in New York, and it goes back to the Harlem Renaissance. So, black folks who, because of racism, couldn't get into the mainstream clubs, so they would go to these African American clubs and participate in these elaborate ballroom traditions, which include houses, which were often named after haute couture houses. So it might be like the House of Chanel or the House of LaBeija, or they would be named after either haute couture or one of the key queens who had been part of that house for a long time. And they ended up being like families, intergenerational families, where you would be around older people, elders, adults, and youth, all in one big room. Next slide. And to say a little bit about them, the houses were treated as real families. So you had a mother and a father in the house who were actually referred to as the mother and the father, and who were responsible for all the young people coming in. And because, again, due to racism, a lot of both racism and homophobia, where kids were often thrown out of their families of origin, they were embraced by these ball culture where they would have a mother or father who would make sure they got a job, would take care of their health care, would feed them if they were starving. So really powerful. And that it was also a place early on where trans identities were welcomed, and that exploration and experimentation with gender was welcomed. Next slide. It was a matriarchal family social structure. So the mother of the house and feminine roles were really valued as key to that. There was unconventional leadership. So there weren't people voted in. There was sort of by walking the balls and giving an incredible performance, you would become a leader. So it was actually through your performance that you took on leadership roles, and people thought you were fierce and that you were worthy of esteem. Personal relationships were powerful, and provided support through a holistic approach around gender identity, sexual identity, and specifically HIV-related service. So especially in the most horrible years of the HIV epidemic, pre-1995, when the protease inhibitors came out, these ballroom scenes were a place where people could go and get support. And that was of all ages. So older people who were dying of AIDS would get support from younger folks who would show up and provide support to them. So I love the ballroom culture. I wish it could be provided more broadly in queer culture, this idea of a house or a family, and a familial structure that you create yourself. And often as queer people, we end up having that sort of a secondary family, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, who we look to for this kind of support. Next slide. So this one, I want to talk about the Gay History Wiki, and this is about elders and ancestors. Next slide. This is a project it was an idea I came up with, again, influenced by Jewish culture and my love of ancestors. If you haven't gotten that already, I love a dead person, and I love a dead person's story. But I heard about the Shoah Project, and so I decided I wanted to find out how many gay men had died of AIDS in Philadelphia. No one had ever asked that question, and I went to the AIDS office in Philadelphia, and they told me, this was almost 10 years ago at that time, 4,600 gay men had died of AIDS in Philadelphia. And I happen to know, because at one point that I'd done a census, that currently there are 25,000 gay men in Philadelphia. Yeah, so 4,600 gay men, here's some of them. And what I began to do was collect their names and find out who they were. And I was able to collect over 1,000 names of these men who died of AIDS in Philadelphia. All kinds, like people who were very famous, opera singers, performers, politicians, and then guys who worked at the deli, just regular guys. It was kind of everyone in between, right? You can let it go to the next one. But these were the kinds of people I found: artists, politicians, librarians, fathers, brothers, editors, geeks, best friends, sloppy drunks, disco mavens, DJs, academics, hairdressers, opera singers, bartenders, activists, uncles, homeless gay men, elite gays, fans of Rehoboth. Oh, you need to go. Or Fire Island. They danced at the steps. Denizens of Judy Garland Park, which is the cruising park. Journalists, fashionistas, architects, real estate agents, students, hustlers, and numerous people who I'm sure would have been here if they were still alive. And so just imagining this huge community of people who had died. And what I learned from the Shoah Project, I think you can go to the next one now, that it's important to remember who they were. Next slide. And that there was already a model in Jewish community, which is the Yarzeit. And so the Yarzeit is a candle that gets lit once a year for an ancestor of yours who died on the anniversary of their death. And so just being forced to remember your grandmother died on June 16th, once a year, going to light a candle. And we also had the AIDS quilt. But I felt like I wanted something more powerful than a candle or the AIDS quilt. As much as I love the AIDS quilt, it's truly two-dimensional, and it's not allowed to change. The quilt panel you get when it's originally made is the quilt panel that you always get. Does everyone know what the AIDS quilt is? Anyone? Raise your hand if you don't. It's okay. Oh, that's good to know. So the AIDS quilt was this huge project that was created in the late 80s to document people who died of AIDS. And when your friend or family member died, you create a quilt panel, and it got mailed to San Francisco and became part of this huge national quilt. And it was unveiled a number of times on the Washington Mall, thousands and thousands of panels. And just to go, and I did this a couple of times, and to see these thousands of panels, you just cry. It was just so moving to see how many people had died. And so I was inspired by this idea of the AIDS quilt. And God, it's really moving to me that so many people don't know what it is anymore. Like, to me, that's why it's so important to have these kind of conversations. Like, the history gets forgotten so quickly. Next slide. So I discovered the Shoah Project, which was this idea that in the Holocaust, that you would not forget a single Jew who had been murdered in the Holocaust. So there was this commitment among Jews where they would create lists of all the Jews who'd been murdered in a particular town. And then they began to find the people who survived and interview them. So you survived, you're from this town. And so these cute little grandmothers and grandfathers would tell their stories. And Steven Spielberg paid for this project, invested lots of money into it. And basically the commitment was, we're not going to forget a single story, because if we do, we're basically disrespecting the lives of these Jews, both the ones who died and who survived. And that was really powerful to me, because I felt like 4,600 gay men, and all the gay men I know, nobody knows anything about all of them. If I had asked them about any of these guys, even the ones I knew, like Dominic and Kiyoshi, who I mentioned in the beginning, no one would know who they were. So I wanted to create a Shoah project of my own. Next slide. It's called the Gay History Wiki, and it's at gayhistorywikispaces.org. You can check it out. So basically, I created a wiki page for each of those 1,000 guys. And on the wiki page, I would go home at night, and I would get on Ancestry.com, or I would Google, and I would find whatever I could find out about them: when they lived, when they died, any obituaries, any information about them. And these fascinating stories emerged of these men who had had incredible lives. I often say, they were risk takers, and so part of the risk led to their HIV infection, but often part of the risk led them to be incredible in their other areas of their lives, incredible artists, incredible performers, risk takers in other ways. And so just to tell you some of these guys, there's Kiyoshi again. This is Essex Hemphill, black gay poet. This is Jose Guerrero, who worked at a deli on Broad Street, but his lover created his page and wrote just beautiful poetry about the impact on his life. This is Arnold Jackson, who's a black gay man, incredible activist, and he didn't believe in HIV drugs. He wanted to find alternative therapies, and he made it his business to sort of educate people about yoga, nutrition, stress relief, because he felt that the drugs were poison. And it turned out that the early drugs were poison, that he was right. Later on, they weren't so poisonous. This is Kurt Borashevitz, who is a DJ, and he also wrote a whole lot of disco hits. So, as a big disco fan, I wanted to make sure that he was on there. And one of Philadelphia's great discos was named after him, called Kurtz. And this is Joe Beam, who wrote a famous gay anthology called In the Life, which, if you're interested in black gay life, is still one of the first books to read. And he worked at Giovanni's Room, which is the gay bookstore in Philadelphia. But there are hundreds of others of these guys. You can go to the next slide. I already introduced you to Dominic. So he died in 1993 at age 46. So he died soon after this picture was taken. Next slide. There's Kiyoshi again. He died in 2000 at age 57. Here's some of the things he did. He actually sat in the Core Restaurant sit-in on Route 40 in Aberdeen, Maryland, not too far from here. 1963, the Martin Luther King speech. And he met King at the Willard, there it's bouncing, at the Willard Hotel. Injured at the State Capitol building in Montgomery, Alabama. He was beat up by the police there. At that first gay rights demonstration in front of Independence Hall, again, back to that sort of key moment in gay history. He marched on the Pentagon as sort of anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, early gay rights demonstrations. And one of the cool things he did was brought gay liberation to the Black Panthers, which at the time, you can't imagine it, but there was this National Black Panther Conference, and he brought the first gay workshop there, which was welcomed and embraced by Eldridge Cleaver and other Black Panthers. So just an incredible person. Next slide. And this is Jim Burgess. Like, part of my commitment was to just acknowledge kind of like the party boys. And he was a DJ at the Saint, a famous nightclub in New York. But he was also an opera singer who sang at the Met. Just all these, this wonderful complexity to people's lives. You can go to the next slide. So I ask you to consider, what if your social networks, what if your Facebook network included dead people in your life? So you know how sometimes it says people you might know, and you can click on them and add them? What if it suggested dead people you might know? So it might be friends of your grandparents, or friends who have died. When people die on Facebook, there's maybe a memorial page, but we sort of lose track of them. We never engage with them in the same way we did when they were alive. What if we continue to engage with people on Facebook after they died, and actually embrace them as ancestors? So this is just showing how I think of my social network. So it's me and my brother and my best friend of many years. And then on the dead side, my dead grandmother, who I was really close to, a friend of mine who died of cancer, and then 27 friends who died of AIDS. But really imagining both the live and dead side as really fertile territory for me to explore, and as part of my entire cultural network. Just because people die, I don't let go of them. And sometimes I do this practice when they die. What's the one thing I love about them most that I'm going to carry forward? So that person was a really great public speaker, and they used to harangue the audience. So every once in a while, I'm going to harangue the audience as a way of acknowledging that person. Or she was really good at cooking a great meal for an activist meeting, and I'm going to do that now. I'm going to cook a great meal for an activist meeting. So carrying on dead people by taking on their skills into the future. Next slide. So just this value of the strengthening your wisdom, skills, and energy by tapping into your social network of ancestors and beginning to think of your social network as including them. Next slide. We're just about coming to the end. We'll do some Q&A. Here are some things you can do. Expand your personal intergenerational network. So we talked about that earlier. Do an inventory. How many friends do I have who are each in generation? What am I going to do to change that? How am I going to add some seniors? If you're a senior, how am I going to add some young people? Like, the commitment goes in both directions. Building your both your mentor and mentee relationships with those in your communities, and it's fine for them to be secret. I recommend the Google document. It's a lot of fun. You can never lose it. Consider incorporating a ritual of adulthood and perhaps a ritual of eldering, so that members of your community can embrace a role, youth, adult, elder, ancestor, and act on it fully. So, intentionally saying, I'm an adult and here's what it means to me. And for some of you, I'm an adult and I'm a youth. And here's how I'm going to play both of those roles in my community. And here, I'm mapping out, I'm comfortable being an adult for another 5 years, but I see myself gradually elements of eldering coming into my life. I'm going to sit down with some elders and ask them to elder me, teach me how to become an elder. And so that forces you to bring some elders into your life and have conversations with them and say, how do you do eldering? I like the way you do it. Choose some ones who you admire. Next slide. When you leave tonight, make a list of people outside of your own generation who could diversify your generational network, and then go out and meet them. Making the list is key. And in your own community organizing, ensure that the voices of all generations are present. Oh yeah, and you can drop me a line. So there's my information. I'm Harvey Milk on Twitter. That's my email and my phone number, and I'm open to conversations, emails, ongoing conversations, tweets, and I'm happy to take any questions or feedback. In the back.
Yeah, this is just an example of how things might get channeled. It's like in wonderment, the elders to the youth. So I was in San Francisco for a number of years. I stayed at the YMCA, and I did see the Village People show. And for 30 years, I worked in the Park Service. And 40 years later, you'll see little kids that are part of the YMCA. They will be singing YMCA, and they'll be pantomiming their letters.
It's something, right?
Yeah, just wonder what it is.
Yeah, I do. Well, I mean, I think that's an example. I love the insidious ways that queer culture is transmitted. Like YMCA is a great example of that. Like I was doing that song, that dance, well before I knew it was about gay men hanging out at a YMCA. You know, and when I realized that, I was like, wow, how cool that that's what that was about, and that all of my friends were singing it and loving it. And you know that, and it represents this really powerful moment of gay culture, that 70s time, pre-AIDS, when it was so celebrational and so much fun, and you know, and how sad that got lost when AIDS came on the scene in the early 80s. But now, as HIV is treatable, you know, we have this moment, interesting moment, where we have PrEP, which is, you know, prevention drugs that are available to HIV-negative people so they don't have to get infected. We have positive guys on really good drugs, so the virus isn't in them anymore. So like the goal, I think, community-wise, is to reduce the virus in the community as close to zero as possible, so that people don't have to get infected, you know, if you know, for whatever their behaviors look like. And so perhaps you could imagine a moment of joy emerging where sex isn't associated with death, and positive guys aren't afraid of negative, and vice versa, and that you could have that moment of joy again. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Michelle brought this up a little bit when she was talking about places, but how do you envision specific ways of building those community places? Like especially, and again, Michelle brought this up, when a lot of the interaction that we have with people, not necessarily even specifically queer people, but just friends of any type, is through this kind of virtual lens. So I guess my question is, how do you see integrating like virtual and physical spaces of community?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that online social communities are really powerful, and I'm not a Luddite. Sometimes I've thought I would love to live in an anonymous community, but I'm actually really embracing of these communities and these cultures and imagining what it's like to strengthen. So if you look at the mapping of internet communities, there's the core community. So if you talk about, let's say, an online chat room, there's the core community that's really plugged in, that people are responding to every question and know everyone's name, and oh, that's that crazy person who responds to everything, and you know, that's the person who always annoys me, that's the person I always agree with. But those people who you always know, and then there's the lurkers, who are sort of on the outside of the social network, not plugged in as much. So it's really interesting looking at what makes that core group. What does it take to create that core group? And I think it's a couple things. You know, I'm really a believer in the power of introduction by social media. So, you know, a lot of people think that the most important thing is your own relationships with people, but what's really powerful is when you introduce someone. So if I introduce John to one of you in the room, like you'll always remember that I was the one that introduced him to you, and I've then sort of strengthened my network. Not only have you met John, but you've gotten more firmly connected to me through John. So using these social communities to introduce people, make connections, identifying, oh, you know what? I noticed that both of those people are from Lubbock, Texas, and one of them's living in San Francisco, one of them's living in Philadelphia, but we're a part of this Texas online group, and I'm going to connect them. What could you do for the Lubbock queers? You know, how could we invest, maybe raise some money for Lubbock queers? And you know, you can become that person who makes those introductions. I'm someone like that. Like, I notice. You know, I'll go on Facebook. I spend ridiculous amounts of useless hours, like looking at, you know, oh, these people all went to college with me at the same time, and I'll pull up that Facebook list and I'll go through it, and then I'll look through all their friends. Oh, that's interesting. And then I'll pull up, oh, who of those works at Microsoft? Oh, all these ones. And then I have this little core group of Microsoft people who are all in my network, but I didn't know. And I sometimes think, well, if I wanted to do something at Microsoft, I'd have that list. And so to think about how you can use the technology to identify groups, core groups, that you could actually do organizing in. But I think that role of introducing is really powerful. And I think also sort of noticing who the outliers are and how you can pull them in. So it may be somebody who just occasionally comments, who occasionally engages, and to look at what it would be like to pull them closer into the core of the community. For me, it's about strengthening that core. Like on Twitter, I actually wrote an article about this, like the power of retweeting people. Like when you retweet people, they appreciate that. And you know, it may just seem like this silly little thing, but you can become a megaphone for another person on Twitter and thus give voice to what they need to have said. And that's a community building effort to actually do that. I used to spend a lot of time thinking about those things. And I think, you know, what I'll say without a lot of deep thought is that my concern is that we need more face-to-face time with each other in general, and that social media, and I know this is true of me, like I'll spend hours sitting in my room on Facebook, you know, and it's helpful in different ways. I learn things, I read articles, I meet new people, I make connections. But I remember 15 years ago, I used to have conversations with my best friends on the phone every night. I would be on the phone with them for an hour or two. I never do that anymore. Phone conversations, like they would think I was crazy if I called them. But like a text or an email. So I've been pushing myself to call my friends more lately and realizing it's so much more satisfying. This is just for me. So I don't even know if people who have been born since that time when people used to call each other could even imagine that. And there probably are people who phone their friends. But it was just a world where email, that sort of ambient connection that you get through Facebook, this sense of being connected. I kind of know what's going on with John because I read his Facebook page every day. But I'm not having the intense conversations where he's really telling me what's got him depressed and that he felt suicidal last week and that he has these frustrations. And so that's what I'm just trying to figure out, whether social media in the end, like part of the argument of the Amish, which is really powerful, they're not anti-technology just for the sake of being anti-technology. They're anti-technology when it pulls you away from that core of community. So it's fine to drive a car if you're driving to work to sell milk at a farm 100 miles away. It's not okay just to drive a car to drive, because you might drive away from the community. And so I do think about that. Is technology, you know, creating more opportunities for us to be isolated? And I think maybe one of the big questions for 21st century technological organizing is how do we create technology that brings us more tightly together? And I believe it's possible, I just don't know what it looks like yet. Did I answer your question? I don't know what to.
Yeah, like kind of using technology, like because it's a tool, like thinking of the way that we use it for a specific purpose, which is connection and community building. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I just had
Yeah.
two quick announcements to make
Sure.
before we wrap up. And one is we had an extraordinary 29-year-old queer elder in the room who invited Chris Bartlett. I just want to recognize and thank John Jarbo, Artistic Director of the Bearded Ladies. And
Thanks, John.
the other is that in the spirit of this conversation, any Washington College student who would like to continue the conversation is welcome to join me and John Jarbo and Chris. I think we already have a couple of students joining us for dinner after this. It's on the Star Center. If you've already eaten, come join us for dessert, and we'll continue this intergenerational conversation.
Yeah, and send me an email. Nice to meet you all.
And thank you to Chris.
Thanks.